Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And it's a big one. Another solo album review. One of the biggest. This time from Bob Dylan, Rough and Rowdy Ways. I know how reviews like this are supposed to go, because they're actually deceptively easy to put together, because you say, well, what more can I say about Bob Dylan? You rattle down his Wikipedia page, you throw in the obscure mid-career highlight that shows you might know what you're talking about, for me it's always 1983's Infidels, and then you rattle off a few token sentences about oblique but poignant writing overcoming the production and the arrangement and Bob Dylan's decrepit vocals. I mean, you're not about to even trying to code his poetry beyond some token observances, because it's Bob Dylan. He's got the cult following and legacy artist past that is second to none. And who in the nine hells are you in order to check that? And it's even worse if you have criticisms of the album, or you actually want to dig deeper than just furiously masturbate at the feet of a man who many will call the greatest songwriter of the 20th century. Hell, scratch greatest songwriter, greatest writer. He's got a Nobel Prize, for God's sakes. Again, who the hell am I? I'll be blunt. I hate those reviews and how certain publications have already reserved year-end list spots for this, you know the ones, because they're doing it on birthright. It's more hagiography than analysis, more the comforting blanket of reassurance for the Bob Dylan cult that he hasn't spent most of the last decade covering Frank Sinatra, and that, yes, he is still truly interested in making generational or maybe even interesting artistic statements. And sure, he's earned the right to do that. He can do whatever the hell he wants, he's 79. But reading modern fawning reviews of Bob Dylan can be a little bit excruciating. The punches are pulled, the legend has long overtaken the man, which even Bob Dylan himself might disdain going back to 2012's flawed but generally solid album Tempest, his last project of original material 8 years ago. And I'm left wondering, who in the hell any of that serves? Again, I go back to masturbation. Instead of delivering any sort of critical or poetic analysis, too often mainstream critics have felt obliged to join into the circle jerk and chants of "we are not worthy," which, I mean, forget convincing a new audience to try to get on board with Bob Dylan's 39th album or even getting them to care. Again, it just comes across as a bit self-serving. But you know what, to be at least a little charitable, I do get it. Bob Dylan's been such a centerpiece in so many people's musical education and experience that you want that wizened genius to deliver more gold, especially in times of trial and struggle, for the soul of that man who revolutionized political music in the 60s to burst forth again, help you recapture some of that fervor. And let me make this clear, even if I don't really have those expectations, I did really want to like it. And I'm not above covering albums from ancient legends and loving them too. Seriously, just like Moby Dick by Terry Allen, it's fantastic. I reviewed it in January, and he's only 2 years younger than Dylan. But alright, what do we find on Rough and Rowdy Ways? Well, here's the thing. I'm not going to come here and say this reaches all the critical hype, because so much of that is bound up in hero worship from a certain generation and some established publications that, with a sober second glance, just does not reflect the intentional weight or lack thereof of Dylan's text. Even considering all the myth-making he might be doing on this project, he's also canny enough to play just enough into it. So, of course Bob Dylan fans are going to love it, and I'd argue it's probably even an easier or maybe even better album than Tempest was. It's looser, Bob Dylan's voice actually sounds a bit better, it's not as relentlessly bleak, and even if the best songs from that album can capture a visceral energy that's not here, I will say this is a bit better. That said, I'm not sure I could call it great for me. Not just because of Dylan the poet or Dylan the singer, but Bob Dylan the producer and arranger. Great writing can only elevate so-so music for so long, and again, it's not like he doesn't have peers who opt for a similar style of writing, but can reap much greater rewards out of the music behind them. You know what, in fact, let's start there. Because when Bob Dylan entered his better experimental years in the 90s and parts of the 2000s, he started working with a few other producers, but has eventually wound up as one of the only guys in the production booth for comfortably over a decade. And it's not like this comes from a lack of collaborators that want to work with him. Producer Blake Mills, former Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers keyboardist Ben Montench, and even Fiona Apple, they all helped on this album in modest ways. Ways. But that doesn't really parallel to what Rick Rubin did working with Johnny Cash on the American recordings, and if Bob Dylan was giving us compositions and production that could match his writing, especially given how much he's looking to tell more epic stories with this project, I mean, instead of just cycling back to relatively predictable traditional pop and swampy blues progressions, I might be a bit more charitable. But that's exactly what we got. And there's a limit to how annoyed I can be with it. Again, everyone is here for Dylan's poetry. The music's more of a backdrop anyways, and it's not like it actively drags down the album, but it doesn't really elevate it either, especially when Bob Dylan is just gonna go through verse after verse after verse without even attempting a hook. And if you're not gripped by the storytelling or the lyricism or Bob Dylan's very plain, haggard delivery, you would not go back to this for the instrumentation or production alone. It's likable, but it's sedate, it's rounded, it's thick in the low end, but either melodically constantly on the cusp of fading away with thin acoustics, or in the blues moments, kind of on the cusp of becoming a bit of a parody of itself. It only rarely feels like it gathers the sort of potency it could. Now, of course, the big exception to all this is Murder Most Foul, a lengthy and genuinely beautiful piece that is really impressive, but also feels tacked on to the end of a project where I would argue not only it could be better sequenced within the track list, maybe after Mother of Muses, but also shows a care and a subtle grandeur in the mix that the majority of this album never even tries. More to the point, it also shows that the rambling style of scattered imagery and kaleidoscope of references doesn't just require bare bones arrangements to sound stunning or be impactful. And for an artist who opens up his project with the egocentric "I contain multitudes," and he's one of the very few who can pull that flex off convincingly, well, it applies a hell of a lot more to his writing than his production here. That's all I'm saying. And at this point, I know some of you are already going to say, critique what you have, not what you might want. After all, there is a deceptive thematic point in how Bob Dylan the legend demystifies himself to a very human level in the arc of the album, and that helps a man even like him remain relatable. And you know what, there's real truth to that. Bob Dylan's command of populism has always been a strength for him, and when he does get into the more rambunctious, playful moments on this project, it can be really enjoyable, and keeps this project from being as dour and depressing as some of these songs might imply. But it's delivered with an air that won't even try to grip the audience if you're not invested in that writing. And I can argue that will hurt the replay value, especially when the blur of details starts to seem a little obtuse or overwritten, or just a string of details that might be tied to its era it's referencing, with only haphazard context. I mean, I have an issue with this sort of postmodern free association anyway, and the only reason Bob Dylan can, mostly, get away with it is his eye for poignant era-specific detail, where it becomes more about the painting of the scene at the time than smashing elements together randomly and then shout America. But it's not always gonna click. And again, it's not like we don't have comparison points anymore to this style of writing, where if you're not invested in Dylan and his very specific frames of references, you might not capture the same poignancy. And I'm gonna say it, Murder Most Foul might be the most stark example of it, in the painting of John F. Kennedy's assassination. I mean, I know the history of that era, with John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Camelot and Marilyn Monroe, and the weight that family gave itself in the early 60s that was only magnified by Bobby's assassination later, and the reams of conspiracy theories spanning the Zapruder film and Lee Harvey Oswald and the Mafia and the CIA even, all amidst a short-circuited feeling that America would never be the same from then on. But if you don't know that history or the long list of songs that Bob Dylan references in the final verse, how much can this really recapture that gravitas of that era? Would you even care to try and find out? I mean, let me make a comparison to another artist who's often branded as a prophet in his own right, Nick Cave, and his 2013 song Higgs Boson Blues. A lot of similar, abstract, usually a little absurd sounding associations, references to classic rock, and also Hannah Montana, if you know you know, and a feeling of great calamity that you can't quite understand but may have shaken you at your core. Murder Most Foul has that, but I'd argue Higgs Boson Blues is just so much more powerful, not just because of more urgent production and arrangements, but also because the themes of cataclysmic loss of faith in the face of uncontrolled, amoral reason are not explicitly tied to recapturing a moment in time, which gives it a slightly more gripping universality. And you know what's funny is that even despite all that, Murder Most Foul is a legit great song, And on writing alone, as much as I might wish that Bob Dylan's production could rise to more, he is an incredibly potent singer-songwriter, and sometimes the poetry, it is enough, especially given Bob Dylan is still self-aware and can still strike the balance between some level of accessibility and the wry, deeper levels of insight and emotion and humor in his poetry. For one, as much as it might seem like the first couple songs here are built on the foundation of recognizing his legacy and cultural heft as he reckons with the nearing inevitability of death, but as much as he evokes great men in parallel, there's a thematic shift on my own version of You that's broadly taking the piss out of all of it. Speaking from the perspective of an audience who has formed a composite idea of Bob Dylan in defiance of God and good taste, casting him himself as the Frankenstein's monster, as the audience tries to turn back time and bring him to life. And as much as Bob Dylan wants to play with the more irascible side of this, which comes through in the hard words of truth on False Prophet, or about how he will drift in and out of faith on Goodbye Jimmy Reed, he's also smart enough to flip the script pretty early and highlight a real sense of sincerity. I made up my mind to give myself to you might seem like a love song, but its target is twofold. Death itself and accepting its passage with clarity and peace, but also the audience who's gonna enshrine him in memorial anyway, with his legacy eclipsing his humanity a little bit. Which, incidentally, is the big reason why it makes all the sense in the world that Murder Most Foul is on the album, cause that happened to Kennedy as well. Indeed, one thing prevalent about Dylan's writing here is how much the great men he references are long gone, and how, or if, the world changes in their absence, but also where most of his company and those he considered peers are now ghost, which means that the various deaths and afterlives he sees, he mostly faces alone. He seems more irritated than actively intimidated by death on Black Rider, where he throws in dick jokes and Monty Python references at him, and for as much as crossing the Rubicon is literal in referencing the days to when Julius Caesar crossed that river, it's also hard not to notice how that song's 9 verses have their symbolic parallels rooted in Dante's Inferno. By the 9 hells, indeed. But the 2 songs, I would argue, tap into what he might think of heaven or salvation the most, and indeed what can be left by most great men. They come on Mother of Muses and Key West Philosopher Pirate. The former a plea for inspiration that places him on a very human level, confronts him with some of that humanity, with some really inspired Leonard Cohen references to boot, and the latter peels through complicated relationships with faith, especially Judaism. And while there is a humanity that comes in walking towards Key West, which is a real place, but the framing of paradise amidst the scrabbling of pirate radio, a dizzying array of floral scents, old beatnik artists around him, a lot of his old inspirations in Ghost, and a past reworked just enough to enable art's immortality as he passes. It's a powerful, it's impressionistic, it's introspective, it's a great way to close the project. Which is why I don't really love Murder Most Foul places the extended coda, because even if it echoes his own artistry being interwoven to the trappings of legacy and history, the framing of unanswered questions doesn't really fit how Bob Dylan approaches the unknown in the arc of the rest of the album. Not so implacable in its weight, but with wry humor and a weary exhale. He knows his multitudes are in the hands of the world. But that's the odd thing about this album, how it treats history and the great men within it. Because on the one hand, there's a scattered, genuine unease at how history seemed to bend after Kennedy's assassination. But on the other, Bob Dylan seems accepting of however his own legacy will be enshrined, where it's clear he's made his peace with both death and his audience. And it might seem like an odd thematic contradiction, where this album is made by one among greats that gains unique power from that greatness of that voice, only to constantly shrink into the human as the focus will narrow. Or hell, maybe it's Bob Dylan consciously giving his artistry to encircle the world while he, as the man, the philosopher pirate on the outskirts, can privately prepare himself to cross that Rubicon in his own rough and rowdy ways, whatever that might take him. And with all that in mind, folks, these are always the tough ones, because the writing, it's excellent, you know that. The poetry's dense and layered, but accessible and thoughtful and funny, and all the rest of the multitudes that Bob Dylan himself will describe and has earned. And I'll even argue his delivery is, again, a little bit better than it was on Tempest. Clearly those years performing Sinatra helped somewhere. And I'm also the critic on YouTube who will place lyrics and above and beyond so much, but I also can't ignore how underwhelming a lot of the actual music is behind him. Again, it's not bad. It's spacious, it's tasteful, it's what you would expect from late period Dylan. But paradoxically, for a man reflecting upon how the lives of great men shaped history and the world, the sound, the motive focal point, will be most received by those who have already seen and accepted any possible change, and they don't want any more. Maybe part of this is me just having such an easy comparison point with Terry Allen's Just Like Moby Dick, which tackles a lot of analogous themes, but is a lot more rich and robust in the arrangements and compositions, which the vast majority of critics didn't hear at all this year, because not all legendary septuagenarian singer-songwriters have Bob Dylan's platform and fan base. And I also know that this album is way easier for me to appreciate than to like or love. And I'll be honest, I don't see myself going back to it in the same way. Even the parts I would argue are great. It's just that sort of album for me. And you'd think that most audiences, especially with those who have been through Bob Dylan through his many rough patches over the decades, they'd get this, they'd be more appreciative of my thoughtful analysis. But I also know that me giving this a very strong 7 out of 10 and a measured recommendation, they will perceive me as contrarian by people who will go to reviews to have their opinions validated, not to engage more deeply or ask the harder questions. Hell, it's why reaction content does so well on this godforsaken platform, because it's not about examining the emotional response, but the communal sharing of it. Again, there's a place for that, and you know what, for everyone who's peeved about this score, like, Bob Dylan is 79, he does not know who I am, and he does not give a solitary fuck about what I think. His legacy is long secured, and if my criticisms really did bother you so, on a project I still like, but just don't quite love, and I'm really envious of those people who do, I mean, ask yourselves why that is. Is it because deep down you might share some of those observations more than you might think and don't want to admit it to yourself? Because on some level you can't go back to how he last really changed the world? See, the funny thing about that, in my own analysis, Bob Dylan addressed that himself directly on this album. I mean, he's given all that to the world. We're all just a slow coming home. Take that as you will. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. You'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Folks, please keep it chill in the comments. I understand Bob Dylan is a cult following and he's a legend, but legends are not averse or they're not immune to criticism, and I think he's handled plenty of it over the decades. And again, he doesn't care about me. So hey, comments down there, just keep it civil. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in supporting this channel, again, during tough times, don't worry about me if you can't, and I'm not going to hold that against you. But if you want to, link to my Patreon is right over there. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.